With the arrival of the Europeans, of course, things began to change, because for the Europeans, it was getting control of the land. And in gaining control of the land, they could not handle living next to these so-called savages. And we somehow had to be colonized. We had to forget our way of life and live and become part of a new society, a new system. And then that's when formal education started becoming part of our lives. Children started schools, and back then it was the same as every other European student in this country at that time. And they had the one-room schoolhouses, and I know my mom always shared stories of a one-room schoolhouse in Eskasoni as she was growing up. And you know, they didn't, most of them didn't go past grade 6, because that was the one-room schoolhouse. It went up to grade 6. And then, but because she wanted to become educated, she had to leave the community. And in leaving the community, she would have to go to, I think she went at that time to Mabo. And Mabo was kind of, it was a boarding school. So she would leave her family, be gone for the week, and then come home on holidays. And so she got educated formally. Then, of course, the residential school, and I know you did the whole spiel on the residential school, so I won't spend a lot of time on that, but I know it was such a horrendous time. And the whole idea of the residential school was that the students would forget who they are. And then, of course, they would also become skilled tradespeople. They would never amount to anything more, because they're just Indians. So they would become skilled tradespeople, and that's all they were taught in the residential school. And even the girls were only taught to cook and clean. They were never expected to be more than housekeepers. But then, there wasn't just the residential schools as well, because in the communities, those students who did not attend the residential school were educated as well. And they were educated in the Indian day schools. And the Indian day schools that the kids were attended had the same mentality as the residential school, although they were never beaten, because the kids had to go home to their school, go home to their parents at the end of the day. And it wouldn't look good with them going home with bruises, right? At least it wouldn't stop. At least it would have, at least that would not have been the end of it right there. So at the Indian day schools, it was the same mentality. They were only taught English. They were forbidden to speak their language. They weren't beaten, but they were forbidden to speak their language. And they also were only to ever become skilled tradespeople. Nothing more. So lo and behold, our students were then getting through the junior high and the Indian day schools. The residential schools were beginning to be questioned. And people were finding out what was going on there, and it wasn't looking very good on the government. So then, with all of this happening and our students now graduating high school, there was also a period of time when our students attended university and graduated from university. They had to give up their status in order to become university graduates. They had to enfranchise. And there are a number of people in our communities who had to do that. They had to give up their status to become educated. And by their status, I mean give up their rights as Mi'kmaq people. And that's the only way that they could become educated. A university education. That was the price you had to pay, was to give up who you are. So that was quite a dark history for us. And back in 1969, when the Liberal government introduced the white paper policy, I remember that so very well, and I'm not giving my age away, because we had moved to Sydney Forks, and my dad was started working for an organization which was a lobbyist organization against the white paper policy and started advocating for Aboriginal rights, Aboriginal and treaty rights. And you know, Dad would always come home and tell us all these stories about what was going on and what was happening, and he always made sure we knew about who we are and our history, and it didn't matter where we lived. And I guess it was his way of getting back at the nuns in the residential school, because he was a student of the residential school, that he made sure we always spoke our language, no matter where we were. So all of us had to speak our language. There was no choice. And not that I minded, because I was always very proud of that. I've always been very proud of having my language and my parents making sure that we knew who we are and where we came from and our language. So in 1969, with the white paper policy being introduced and everyone lobbying against it, and that's how, I guess that's how change happens. And when you think about it, and you know, looking at some work of the critical theorists in any topic, I guess, or any subject, especially education, that's how change occurs, is when people start asking questions and start forming lobbyist groups or protest groups. That's how change occurs, pressuring the government. And so at the same time, while the provinces were forming unions, and unions of the Union of Nova Scotia Indians here in Nova Scotia, as a lobbyist group, we were also forming groups nationally. And the National Indian Brotherhood was formed around that time, which later became the Assembly of First Nations. And at that time, they were talking about also trying to you know, change education. First of all, the elimination of the enfranchisement for students going into university, because we were getting a lot of graduates and a lot of people were beginning to go to university at the time. And it's really interesting. And that carried on into the 70s. And in the early 80s, it was finally time that we took control of education. We took control of our education, and communities were just, you know, like baffled why they hadn't done it before, and a lot of the times they were questioning and thinking, well, we can't do any worse for our people by us taking over education. And so they did. The National Indian Brotherhood had written a paper on Indian control of Indian education, and a lot of the things that were talked about are pretty much the same things that we talk about today. Retention of language, graduation rates, all of those things. Those were the topics of discussion then. They are still the topics of discussion today in education. So in the 80s, when we were taking control of education, which included post-secondary education. So when I had first started university back in around 81, I had to apply to the Indian Affairs. I had to apply to Indian Affairs for funding for post-secondary education. And I had to do that, get my living allowance from Indian Affairs at that time, and my tuition was paid for by Indian Affairs. All of a sudden, in 82, the Eskasoni band approached us and told us, post-secondary education students, that you no longer apply to Indian Affairs, you come to the band for your funding. And that was a huge change, because they had taken over education